Hi, I'm Aidan from Mysteries Ahoy, a blog where I write about crime fiction old and new, but mostly old. Today I'm going to be talking to you about The Black Spectacles by John Dickson Carr, which is also known by its American title, The Problem of the Green Capsule. This book has a very special place in my heart, though it's not necessarily a representation of the things that people think of when they think of the name John Dickson Carr. It contains many of the qualities found in other examples of his work, and I think it contains some of his best plotting. So let's begin by outlining the book and talking about what happens in The Black Spectacles. The Black Spectacles is a book that is divided into 4 clear sections. The first part outlines the events that happened. The second part, the police investigation. The third part, the investigation by our detective, Dr. Fell, and the last part brings everything back together. So let's begin with the very first part and the prologue that opens the book. This is set in the city of Pompeii. Now, Pompeii was a tourist destination at this point. It had been rediscovered, and the book opens inside the home of a famous Pompeian poisoner. Our characters are all tourists. They are all traveling to Italy for reasons that we'll go into in a moment. And they go into this home and a conversation begins about poisonings. Now, this is super important because the setting provokes a conversation that another character will overhear. This character will be the police detective who will be investigating a subsequent case involving everyone else in the house. What we discover is that the small village that they come from has had an issue with a poisoning. And not only that, one of the people in the house, Marion, the niece of Marcus Chesney, has been suspected of that poisoning. So the family have decided they're going to take a vacation. They're traveling out of town just to get away from the rumor, the scandal, the innuendo. Now, obviously, while people suspect that Marion is involved, they have no proof. And Marion isn't at risk of arrest. It's simply she wants to be away from the gossip. While they were traveling, they meet a young man, and the young man gets engaged to Marion. And in this villa, Uncle Marcus is going to talk to that young man about the issues that have happened back at home and try and warn him this match that you're entering into may not be in your best interests. This isn't because he doesn't like the young man. He recognizes the young man's potential in many ways, but he doesn't exactly want to let go of Marion either. Marion is, in effect, acting as his housekeeper. So you've got a tension there already. Now, our onlooker, the police detective, overhears this conversation, overhears talk of the scandal, and then part 1 begins with a new murder having happened, the murder of Uncle Marcus. And it happens in rather unusual circumstances. Uncle Marcus has decided, after a fight at dinner with his family, that he wants to prove a point. The argument is about whether anyone's memory is reliable. And he argues you can put 3 people in a space, tell them all to watch the same set of events, and they will not be able to all give the same story. So he devises this sort of theatrical thing to happen at midnight. He will be up on the stage performing a series of actions. They have to watch and observe closely, and at the end, he's going to be asking them a series of questions. Now, while he's up on stage, everything seems to be going okay. He picks up a series of objects, examines them in turn, and then a figure enters through the window and walks across the stage and puts a green capsule in Uncle Marcus's mouth, which he swallows. At the end of the performance, Uncle Marcus gets up. They go in search of his co-conspirator. When they get outside, they discover he's been knocked unconscious. He's in fact in pretty serious medical condition. And then Uncle Marcus himself collapses. He falls to the ground and dies just a few minutes later. He has been poisoned. And so the question then becomes, who did the poisoning? Now, Carr devises a closed circle. A closed circle is a situation where you have a limited number of suspects. In this case, we have the 3 people in the audience and his brother, who has an alibi as well. Everyone has a cast iron alibi for the time, but they are the only people who knew that he would be up on stage doing the thing he was doing. So, if that's the case, then who could have done it and why? We assume it has to be one of those four people, but as I say, their alibis are all completely impenetrable because the three people in the audience can all give specific testimony to when each other were there. They all saw each other. The brother has an alibi for the specific moment that the death happens. It happens just around midnight. He is away dealing with a medical case at exactly that time. So, who did it and why? The second section of the book basically follows the police investigation. And this is one of the more interesting examples of that. So, Carr keeps his detective back for a while. And we'll go on to talk about why that was the case and why that's a good thing in a moment. But in keeping the detective back for as long as he does, he then has the police ask a series of questions. The questions actually that Uncle Marcus was going to ask after the performance. And it is quite entertaining to see how the conflict between the three people plays out. As Uncle Marcus suggested, they cannot all produce the same set of answers. And there is some interesting discussion of why that is the case. So we get to the end of part 2. And at this point, I want to take a second just to step back and reflect on the options a Golden Age detective writer has in trying to hide the identity of a killer. The first choice that you can make, and in many ways the most convenient one, is simply not to give the reader all of the information until the end of the book. Now, this technique works very well, because if you don't have all of the information, the only way you're getting to the solution is basically through guesswork. But it doesn't feel very fair. Carr takes the opposite approach, which is he takes the reader and he throws information at them. So much information that the relevant pieces become obscured just by the quantity of data, the quantity of observations that the reader is having to make. And Carr trusts that the reader will not be able to connect things in the correct way. Personally, I got nowhere near the solution the first time. The problem, of course, in going back to a book that has as memorable a conclusion as this one is that you can't really re-experience it and question, was I just off my game that day, or is this really a difficult solution to reach? I do believe it's the second. I think it is just a very tough mystery to solve, but I will never know. What I can say, though, is I admire the construction all the more for coming back to this book a second time and looking at it again. So at the end of part 2, we have 2 clear questions to answer. The first is who poisoned the chocolates, why did they do it, and how did they pull it off? The second is who killed Marcus, how did they do it, and why? This brings us to part 3, with the entry of Dr. Gideon Fell, the series detective that Carr uses in this book. Now, of the various detectives that Carr creates, he is by far my favorite. He is more serious than H.M., the character that he uses in his more comical books, written under the name of Carter Dickson. Dr. Fell has an almost academic approach to crime. We discover in this book he's a former school teacher, and the way he approaches detection is to really look at the logical sequence of events and to reassess what information he's been given. He is also prone to giving lectures from time to time. In his most famous book, The Hollow Man or The Three Coffins, Dr. Fell gives a lecture about the various different ways to set up and dismantle a locked room puzzle. This book isn't a locked room, so he takes a different approach with the story. The lecture that we get here is about poisonings, looking at examples of real cases from history and drawing inferences and opinions about those. There's a lot of Carr's own thought that goes into this. We even get a little note from Carr himself, specifically about the case of Dr. Crippen. So this is clearly a topic that interests the author. So why does Carr keep Dr. Fell back as long as he does in the book? By having him enter at the start of part 3, we have an opportunity to then take all of the information that we gathered and taken for granted in part 2, and then look at it again. And in doing so, we learn new things, and we realize mistakes that we may have made. it also allows us to build our sense of anticipation. We know that there is a film of the incident that was created that night. We haven't seen it yet, but we see it at the start of part 4. And once we do, we get the last little bits of information that we need to fully understand everything that's going on. Though, as I stress, I think you could solve this from the information in parts 1 and part 2 alone. I think the solution delivers on a lot of what we want from the book. I found it surprising the first time I read it. I think that it is satisfying in many ways. I think it makes perfect sense. It is logical. It is coherent. It sticks with the themes of the book that have been developed all the way through. So I think this book gives us lots to celebrate. Carr is a master craftsman. He constructs a story with a small cast of characters in a tight, enclosed setting that is a highly technical story in terms of how it's worked. And yet when you read it, it doesn't read technically. This isn't a plot that revolves around mechanisms. Everything that is described is very simple. You just have to be able to imagine it. And I think that readers will be able to do so. The only issue that I have with the book is really a subplot issue. I don't really want to talk in any kind of detail about why that romance doesn't work for me. I think that to do that would be to spoil too much of the book. But it is underdeveloped, it is rushed, and it feels like it's there because Carr wants to include a romance. In fact, in a number of Carr's books, particularly in this period, there is a romantic subplot, and I typically find them underbaked. This one is one of the more unsatisfying examples of that. But other than that, I think everything pretty well works here. For me, this is one of Carr's best constructed stories. It's one of his most interesting concepts, one of the most original and striking ideas. And the use of the cinefilm in many ways elevates this story even further, because this is the rare example of a case where we have a piece of physical evidence that we can anticipate seeing. I think it's an incredible read. It started my appreciation of Carr. I think if you tackle it, if you've never read Carr before, it's a great place to start because it shows many of his skills as a writer. And even though it may not be an impossible crime in the technical sense of the word, I think it does show his ability to craft a really interesting and technically complex murder. So, thanks for joining me. I hope you give Carr a try. And if you do, I really hope you start here. Let me know what you think of the book in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.